So today we're talking about the Southern strategy, or you could see it as how the South became Republican. When we think of Southern states now, we think of them as generally pretty solidly going to Republicans in presidential elections, in the same way that we think of the West Coast as pretty solidly going to Democratic candidates in presidential elections. But how did that happen? When we look at the results of the 1960 presidential election, things look a little bit different. In fact, things almost look, you could say, somewhat reversed from what they are now, with the exception of the Northeast. Now, this election was between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy. You see that there was a third party candidate who also received a few electoral votes, but not enough to win. But you'll notice most succinctly that what we consider now as the South, Texas through North Carolina, generally went for the Democratic candidate. And this was pretty common. The Democrats were the party of the South since the Civil War. Remember that Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. Now, part of the reason in 1960 that John F. Kennedy was able to win the presidential election is because his running mate, his vice presidential candidate, was Lyndon Johnson, who was a Southern Democrat. And he gained the support of the South for Kennedy, who was a very rich New England Democrat, who the Southerners were seen as not as trustful of. So Lyndon Johnson is a Southern Democrat, and in 1963 he becomes president on his own via succession when John F. Kennedy is assassinated. In 1964, he is elected on his own right, so he gets his own full term as president. Now, he was very popular. His big agenda was this war on poverty, which was particularly popular in the South that was still reeling economically. But then, later in 1964, Johnson does something that people in the South don't like. He signs the Civil Rights Act. Now, that is where our story kind of begins. So Lee Atwater at the time was a Republican strategist who was had worked for the Nixon campaign and was going to work for Nixon's next campaign to run for president again in 1968. And he came up with an idea to appeal to the Southern Democrats who were upset about the Civil Rights Act, which you have to remember was a lot of people. The civil rights movement at the time was not popular. Martin Luther King Jr. was a hated figure in most of the country. If you look closely at the favorable and unfavorable responses, so this is people ranking Dr. King on effectively a scale of 1 to 10. Well, they did from -5 to +5. And if they feel highly favorable or unfavorable towards him, in 1966, so right after the Civil Rights Act, is when it hits its peak, where 63% of the country sees him as, quote, unfavorable. And that had been growing since 1963. So, unpopular figure at the time. Atwater says something in an interview in which he uses a word that we won't repeat in this class. He says that in 1954, they would say the N-word repeatedly, and that was something that would appeal to Southern whites. But in 1968, they can't say that. That hurts you, backfires. So, quote, you can say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract. Now, you're talking about cutting taxes and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and a byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. We want to cut this. It's much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than the term they were using before.